In the spring of 1877, a gas main excavation crew working on Broad Street in Providence, Rhode Island, broke through the side of their trench at a depth of 11 feet and exposed something that their foreman, a man named Cornelius Shea, had never encountered in 14 years of digging through New England soil. A wall, not a foundation remnant, not a collapsed cellar, not the rubble edge of a demolished building. A wall, standing, continuous, constructed of coursed granite blocks, each measuring approximately 2 feet by 3 feet, fitted without mortar in a dry stone technique that produced joints so tight that Shea could not insert a folded paper between them. He measured the exposed face from the trench floor upward. The wall extended 7 feet above the trench bottom and showed no sign of a footing, which meant it went deeper than his trench. He measured its thickness where the trench had sheared its face, 4 feet, 3 inches. He sent a crew member to fetch the city engineer's office. The city engineer arrived, examined the wall, asked Shea how long it would take to route the gas main around it. Shea said 2 days. The city engineer said do it. Shea routed the main around the wall in 2 days, filled the trench, and submitted his work report to the Providence Gas Company as normal. His work report, which is in the Providence City Archives under a Public Utilities Excavation Series, describes the gas main route and the reason for the deviation. It describes the deviation as caused by a subsurface obstruction. It does not describe the obstruction as a wall. It does not describe its construction, its dimensions, or the 14 years of Cornelius Shea's professional experience that told him it was not supposed to be there. On the morning of the 3rd day, before the trench was filled, Shea had taken a measurement of the wall's exposed length from the north end of his trench to the south end. The measurement was 61 feet. The wall did not end at either edge of his trench. It ran through his excavation and continued in both directions into the undisturbed earth. He measured 61 feet of a wall that was longer than 61 feet. He wrote it in his personal work log in the notation he used for observations he wanted to preserve outside the official report. The log is in the Rhode Island Historical Society under a labor history donation from Shea's family. The notation is dated April 14, 1877. The Providence City Engineer's Office has no record of any engineering assessment, geological survey, or architectural study conducted on the wall Cornelius Shea exposed in April of 1877. The city engineer who attended the excavation, a man whose name Shea's personal log gives as Whitfield, and who is listed in the city's staff records for that year as deputy city engineer, left no written account of what he saw and produced no report of any kind on the discovery. The Providence Gas Company's route deviation record, which Shea's work report generated, was filed in the normal course of utility administration and contains nothing about the wall's nature. The trench was refilled. The granite ran on beneath the street in both directions, and the only record that it existed for the next 132 years was Cornelius Shea's personal notation in a log donated to a historical society by a family who described it to the receiving archivist as the work diary of a gas main foreman. Shea was not given to exaggeration. He was a working foreman on utility excavations in a New England city during a period of rapid infrastructure development, a man whose daily work required him to assess, quickly and accurately, what he was looking at underground and what to do about it. He had no motive for embellishing the account. He had a motive for keeping it outside the official report. The city engineer had told him to route around the obstruction and continue, which is the instruction you give when you do not want a discovery to become a project. Shea understood the instruction. He followed it. He wrote down what he had seen in the only place that was his own. Before we go further, If you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what Cornelius Shea found beneath Broad Street in Providence, we have to go back, not just to the infrastructure projects of the 1870s and the cities that were rebuilding themselves after the Civil War, and not just to the geology of New England, which contains genuine ancient stonework in the form of field-cleared boundary walls and colonial foundations. We have to go back to a distinction that the official account of subsurface discoveries in American cities has never been willing to make clearly. The distinction between stonework that belongs to the known history of a site and stonework that does not, and the institutional behavior that in case after case chose not to examine the difference. The official history of American urban archaeology presents the subsurface layers of old cities as reasonably well understood: colonial foundations, Native American deposits, geological strata. When unexpected structures are encountered during excavation, the standard institutional response is a pause, an archaeological assessment, documentation, and a decision about preservation or removal. That is the official protocol. It was not the protocol in Shea's Providence. It was not the protocol in the dozens of documented cases between 1840 and 1920 in which utility and construction crews across American cities encountered buried walls and structural elements that the city engineers on site ordered routed around, filled over, and removed from the official record within days of discovery. The protocol that actually governed these discoveries was not preservation. It was concealment. And the distinction between the two is visible in exactly one place: the personal records of the men who did the work. A civil engineer named Frederick Annan, who worked for the Washington, D.C. Board of Public Works from 1871 to 1893, supervised the excavation of more than 40 blocks of the city's street grid during the systematic infrastructure upgrade of the 1870s. In a private memoir written in retirement and never published, held at the Library of Congress Manuscript Division under an Annan Family Papers accession donated in 1931, he describes encountering buried wall sections on 3 separate excavation projects in the capital. The first was on Pennsylvania Avenue in 1873 at a depth of 9 feet, a continuous granite course running east along the avenue's original alignment. The second was on K Street in 1875 at a depth of 13 feet, where individual stones measured 3 feet by 4 feet, and the wall ran at an angle inconsistent with any platted street or property line on the city's survey grid. The third was in 1879, beneath the mall itself, where excavation for a new drainage channel exposed a wall section that Annan described as unlike anything he had encountered in 2 decades of civil engineering. The individual stones were fitted so precisely that his crew initially believed they were looking at a concrete pour rather than coursed masonry, until they were close enough to see the individual block faces. He reported none of these to the Board of Public Works in his official submissions. He wrote about all 3 in his memoir 20 years later, explaining his silence with a sentence that is among the most precise in this entire investigation. It became clear to me, after the first occasion, that the board's protocol was not to examine, but to continue, and that the men who understood why were not the men I was employed to ask. There is a growing body of independent research suggesting that the buried walls encountered during the great infrastructure campaigns of 19th century American cities, the gas mains, the sewer systems, the drainage channels, the road bases, were not random survivals of colonial-era construction. Because colonial-era construction in American cities does not produce dry stone granite courses of 4-foot thickness at depths of 9 to 13 feet below a street surface, that was itself established in the early 19th century. Colonial American construction used local fieldstone, brick, or wood framing. It did not produce the kind of wall that Shea measured in Providence, continuous, mortarless, precisely coursed granite of a wall thickness and a construction quality that exceeds any documented American building tradition of any period. And it did not produce those walls in cities whose entire colonial construction record has been extensively studied and whose surviving, built fabric has been catalogued for a century and a half without any architectural historian accounting for the source of the granite courses. That the utility crews kept finding in the ground. Cincinnati, 1868, a sewer extension crew working on 5th Street encountered, at a depth of 14 feet, a wall section of coursed limestone blocks that the project engineer, a man named Luther Hatch, measured as 5 feet thick and described in his project notebook as running continuous in both directions beyond the trench limits. He noted that the limestone was not a variety quarried in any Ohio operation he was familiar with. He was a civil engineer. He knew where Ohio limestone came from. What was in that trench had not come from Ohio. Hatch's project notebook is in the Cincinnati Historical Society. His notation about the wall is on page 31. The city engineer's office produced no report on the discovery. The sewer was routed around the wall and extended. New Orleans, 1874, workers laying new water mains on Rampart Street broke through what the project foreman described in a written statement to his supervisor as a stone wall of considerable thickness at a depth of 12 feet. The supervisor's response, which the foreman copied into his personal account, instructed the crew to route the main above the wall and to fill the area exposed by the trench with compacted earth. The foreman's personal account is in the Historic New Orleans collection under a private donation accession. The supervisor's instruction is in it. No engineering assessment of the Rampart Street wall was ever conducted. In 12 feet of New Orleans soil, at a depth the city's entire colonial and antebellum construction history cannot account for, a stone wall of considerable thickness was routed around in a day and has not been mentioned in any published history of the city's infrastructure since. St. Louis, 1881, a street paving crew on Market Street broke through a section of earlier paving at a depth of 4 feet and found below it, at a further depth of 8 feet, a continuous granite wall running east along the street's alignment. A city surveyor named Edward Mall was sent to examine the discovery. His survey report, held in the St. Louis City Archives, describes the wall as of unknown date and considerable age, running for at least 93 feet, the full width of his excavation, in both directions. He recommended a formal archaeological assessment before further work proceeded. The city engineer's office responded that no assessment was required and that the paving project should proceed without delay. Mall's survey report is in the archive. It is the only document in the St. Louis City Archives that has ever recommended a formal investigation of a buried wall. The recommendation was refused. Mall never submitted another report about the wall. The city paved over it and continued. His report sits in the archive because no one thought to remove it. It was, apparently, only the recommendation that made it dangerous, and the recommendation had already been dealt with. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. But here is what makes Cornelius Shea's notation different from every other account of buried walls in American cities. In 1923, 46 years after Shea's excavation on Broad Street, a Providence Water Department crew relaying water mains on the same street broke through a wall at a depth of 11 feet in a trench 2 blocks south of Shea's original location. The crew foreman, a man named Patrick Delaney, described it in his work report to the Water Department as a stone wall of unusual construction, continuous beyond the trench, with individual blocks fitted without mortar. He asked, in the work report, whether an engineering assessment should be conducted. The Water Department's response, received the following day, instructed Delaney to route the new main around the wall and continue the project. Delaney filed the work report. He kept a personal copy. That copy, which Delaney's son donated to the Providence City Archives in 1961, contains a handwritten margin note in Delaney's hand that was not in the official submission. It reads, "Spoke to older men in the department. They say this wall has been found before, more than once. Nobody asks why. Nobody asks why." That is the sentence that carries the weight of this entire investigation. Not that the wall was found, but that it had been found before. That the men who worked beneath Providence's streets in 1923 knew that the wall had been there in 1877, and presumably long before that it had been found and routed around and refilled and not examined on multiple occasions, and that the institutional response to each finding had been so consistent and so unremarkable that the older men in the Water Department mentioned it not as a scandal, but as a simple fact of the trade. The wall was there. You routed around it. Nobody asked why. Patrick Delaney had been in the trade long enough to know that this was the answer, but not so long that he had stopped finding it remarkable. He wrote it in the margin of his own copy of his own work report, because the official submission had no space for a question. The question was his. The margin was his. And in 1961, his son donated it to the Providence City Archives along with the rest of his father's papers, and an archivist cataloged it as a Water Department work report, and it sat in the archive for 62 years before anyone connected it to the notation Cornelius Shea had made in a gas main foreman's personal log in the same archive 46 years before Delaney went back into the same street and found the same wall. The Providence City Engineer's Office has never adequately addressed several specific questions about the buried wall on Broad Street. It has never explained why no engineering assessment, archaeological survey, or institutional record of any kind was produced following Cornelius Shea's 1877 discovery, despite the deputy city engineer's personal attendance at the site. It has never explained why Edward Mall's 1881 recommendation for a formal archaeological assessment of the St. Louis Market Street wall, the only such recommendation in that city's archive, was refused by the city engineer's office without any documented rationale. It has never explained what Frederick Annan meant when he wrote that the men who understood the board's protocol for buried wall discoveries were not the men he was employed to ask. Why did a deputy city engineer attend a site in person, observe a dry stone granite wall of 4-foot thickness extending beyond the trench in both directions, and produce no written record of what he saw? Why does Patrick Delaney's 1923 account confirm that the Providence Wall had been found before 1877, making it a recurring discovery that the city's infrastructure workers knew about and the city's engineering record does not contain? Why, in city after city, from Providence to Cincinnati to New Orleans to St. Louis, was the recommendation to investigate the buried walls either never made or made once and immediately refused? Why, in every case, was the choice to root around and continue? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. What we have are a personal notation in the Rhode Island Historical Society, a private memoir in the Library of Congress Manuscript Division, a project notebook in the Cincinnati Historical Society, a personal account in the Historic New Orleans Collection, a survey report in the St. Louis City Archives, and a Water Department work report copy with a handwritten margin note in the Providence City Archives. and a pattern of institutional response across 5 American cities, across 5 decades, that treated buried walls of unknown date and construction as a routine obstruction to be routed around, without examination, without record, without the question that one foreman finally wrote in the margin of his own personal copy of a work report in 1923, because the official submission had no room for it. For the remaining years of his working life after the Broad Street excavation, Cornelius Shea continued laying gas mains in Providence. He found 2 more buried wall sections in his career, both noted in his personal log, both routed around on instruction, neither appearing in any official work report. His log contains 6 pages in total about the walls beneath Providence's streets. The last entry, dated September 1891, records a conversation with a Providence city engineer, a different man than Whitfield, who told him, when Shea mentioned the walls, that every city in New England had them, and that they were older than the cities themselves. Shea wrote that the engineer said this without surprise, without curiosity, and without any apparent sense that the statement required further explanation. Older than the cities themselves. That is what a city engineer said, in passing, in 1891, to a man who had been finding granite walls at 13 feet for 14 years and routing around them on instruction. He said it the way you say a thing that is known and settled and not worth discussing. Shea wrote it down. He had learned, by 1891, that what you thought about the walls was not something that went in the log. The walls are still there, beneath Broad Street in Providence, beneath Market Street in St. Louis, beneath Rampart Street in New Orleans, beneath K Street in Washington, beneath the Mall, beneath the streets of Cincinnati, wherever the utility crews of the 1860s and 1870s and 1880s routed their mains and their sewers around granite courses at depths of 9 to 14 feet and filled the trenches and filed their work reports. The walls continue, in both directions beyond the trench limits, at a thickness and a construction quality that no American building tradition produced, at depths that the city surfaces of the early 19th century were already well above, waiting, in the personal logs and the private memoirs and the margin notes, for someone to write, not settled, not colonial, not explained, and nobody asked why. The official history tells us that the buried layers of American cities contain the remnants of documented construction, colonial structures, Native American deposits, geological curiosities. What the foreman's logs and the civil engineer's memoir and the survey recommendation that was refused tell us is that the buried layers of those cities also contain something that none of the official categories account for. Continuous walls of a construction quality and a material composition that the documented history of those cities cannot explain, that the institutional engineers of the 19th century encountered repeatedly, that the men who worked beside those engineers knew about through the shared knowledge of a trade, and that nobody with the authority to investigate ever asked about. These records survive because people refuse to stop looking. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when you fill the trench. It disappears when the men who saw it write their observations in the only place no one controls, and no one thinks to look. Next week, I am following a thread that connects Frederick Annan's 3 Washington, D.C. wall discoveries to a survey map produced by the Army Corps of Engineers in 1867, the year before Annan joined the Board of Public Works, that shows, beneath the planned infrastructure grid for the city's western quadrant, a series of subsurface features labeled in a hand different from the rest of the map as existing masonry, not planned masonry. Existing, the map is in the National Archives. The label is on it. No Army Corps report describes what was surveyed to produce it.